Flanking! It's one of the most popular optional rules from the DMG. But really, it sucks. Let me explain. Welcome to Pack Tactics, where flanking gives you advantage. We're gonna start by reading the rulebook. I know most of you know what it is, but we're gonna read it anyways. Here we go. If you regularly use miniatures, flanking gives combatants a simple way to grant advantage on attack rolls against a common enemy. A creature can flank an enemy that it can't see. A creature also can't flank while it is incapacitated. A large or larger creature is flanking as long as at least one square or hex of its space qualifies for flanking. Flanking on squares: when a creature and at least one of its allies are adjacent to an enemy on opposite sides or corners of the enemy's space, they flank that enemy, and each of them has advantage on melee attack rolls against that enemy. When in doubt about whether two creatures flank an enemy on a grid, trace an imaginary line between the centers of the creature's spaces. If the line passes through the opposite sides or the corners of the enemy's space, the enemy is flanked. They also talk about hexes, but you can read that yourself. Anyways, this optional rule makes it so defending yourself is harder if you are surrounded by enemies. This is realistic. You might even think that this is a buff to your melee martial players, because they get to attack with advantage more often. However, in reality, it's close to the exact opposite, but we'll get there later. A lot of what I'll say is in line with the article from Tabletop Builds, where they talk about a bunch of optional rules. Which ones are good, which ones aren't, and so on. Link is in the description. There are actually a multitude of reasons why flanking with this optional rule does not work properly in 5e. There are two questions I ask myself when I consider whether to use homebrew or optional rules. The first one is, what am I trying to accomplish? The second one is, does this accomplish what I want it to? One reason I see flanking suggested for games is that it adds mechanical depth. However, in reality, it doesn't add much depth at all. Most of the time, there is little opportunity cost to setting yourself up in a flanking position, especially when one side heavily outnumbers the other, such that it becomes super easy to achieve. If I do this in 5e, run circles around the target like this, that does not trigger opportunity attacks. It's not like Pathfinder 1. So setting up a flanking position is super duper easy. It's almost always optimal to set up flanking, which also leads to conga lines. Kobold, you should come join the conga line, it's so fun! Brilliant game design! There you go, everyone in that line has advantage. And it looks really stupid. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a few situations where flanking presents an interesting choice, but these situations are usually less common than they might appear and often have a best course of action that is easy to identify. Another big reason that I believe this optional rule has little depth is it devalues existing gain advantage. The barbarian's reckless attack becomes next to useless if there's another ally in melee. It basically functions just like pack tactics, although pack tactics can work at range. Another example is Fairy Fire, which becomes even more niche, or knocking someone prone. These features become close to ribbons, whereas they would otherwise be actually useful. Speaking of useful, today's sponsor is Describe, where you can get professionally written box descriptions of basically everything. There's over 10,000 scenes, and they're incredibly useful for immersion. When I DM, I usually have an incredibly hard time describing cities and making them feel populated. That's where Describe is incredibly useful. I can look up city market and take some text from it, like the clamor and clatter of bustling people and animals pulling heavy carts. And then I just integrate that into the game itself. There's even a background sound file here that adds to the immersion that there's a lot of people here. With that little bit of text, I can spin a side quest around it, like a successful perception check. You spot a thief stealing from one of the carts and dashes off down the alleyway. If the players give chase, I can pull up Dark Alleyway and read this bit. You get the point now. But that's not the only thing you get. You get a massive sound library full of original music, which I'm playing right now, and you get a ton of maps with already integrated detailed descriptions. Describe is fantastic. I highly recommend you check it out, and if you like what you see, use the code PACKTACTICS at the checkout to get 10% off your first subscription. Now, the video begins. I don't know why I have so much energy. The two reasons is this is actually a negative addition rather than a positive addition in regards to melee martials. First of all, flanking actually favors the monsters more often than the players. This is assuming you're facing enemies who make use of flanking and that the enemies are more numerous than the melee players. And that generally happens really often. Flanking will have a bigger benefit to the enemies. Without this optional rule, there's only a small subset of enemies that can often get advantage in melee, like wolves. With this optional rule, it basically allows any enemy to get it. This makes ranged combat even stronger than melee combat. To be fair, that was always the case, but it's even more so now. Going into melee with a bunch of mobs is simply not worth it. Well, unless there's a doorway that needs to be blocked, but other than that, I can't think of any. And lastly, flanking is a huge boon to some of the already most damaging spells in the game. Conjure animals and animate objects. These create enough creatures that they should always be able to surround the target, granting all of their attacks advantage. For Conjure Animals, the animals with pack tactics are usually the best ones. Now basically everything has pack tactics. And all of this effectively makes the gap between martials and casters grow even bigger. And let's be honest guys, the spellcasters don't need a boost. In general, I would greatly recommend against using this optional rule. If you really do want to add it, even knowing that it adds little tactical depth, at least consider ways to make it a buff to melee martials instead of a nerf. A good start would be to only allow player characters to benefit from flanking. There's already a ton of player-only rules out there, so why not another one? An alternative or additional change would be to change the benefit from advantage to bonus to attack rolls. That way it stacks with whatever you have that gives you advantage. Another common change that I've heard is that a flanked creature cannot benefit from flanking. This prevents the conga line that I talked about earlier, but this increases the probability that the often outnumbered melee characters will be unable to use flanking. So consider this change with care. And there's also the Pathfinder 1 rule that stops people from running circles around you. This boosts martials in general, especially rogues, and I actually thought that this would be a feature for rogue in 1D. But nope, maybe you can add it instead. Anyways, end the video. By the way guys, Baldur's Gate 3 is out and I'll be making some content for it. There will be a little let's play with my friends and some build videos coming up, so stay tuned. If you like this video, then I hope I earned your subscription and maybe your support on Patreon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!